Hello everyone, and I want to welcome you to this edition of UD Listens. UD Listens is a complement to our Friday UD Talk series, and its purpose is to really introduce the UD community and our alumni community and the broader Dubuque community to some pretty amazing people within our campus community. Today I'm privileged to be able to talk with and join Nelson and Amy Edmonds, who have been with the university for 2 years, and we'll talk about their positions and their perspectives and their areas of responsibilities. So Amy and Nelson, I want to welcome you both. Thank you for being with us. I think we're going to try to model some healthy behaviors here as if this were a classroom. So I wanted everybody to see who you are and kind of put a face to these names, and then we'll try to manage through this. Now, I know we also have face masks, which tend to be a little easier, I think, to talk through, but face coverings. But we'll use these face coverings today. So I'm going to try to put mine on here. There are lots of people who would pay lots of money to do this permanently. So as long as it could kind of muzzle me. So anyway, welcome. It's great to have you with us, and I've known both of you for 2 years now. Yeah. We actually met in this room. And so if the walls could talk from that conversation to now. So it's really a privilege to be able to talk to both of you. I work more closely in this office with Amy, but I work closely with both of you. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we'll see where it goes. So both of you are graduates of Whitewater. You were working there. Amy, I think you were working as an athletic trainer. Nelson, you were doing, well, were you residence life, student life?
Academic advising.
Okay. So, but before that, I think in our conversation, I picked up that you were working with youth that were kind of from challenged backgrounds. The old days with juvenile delinquents. I don't know if you know this, we share that background, but I want to hear your experience. So
yeah, it was a treatment center in Dowsman, Wisconsin, and so this very kind of rich area, but in kind of the middle of this cornfield where all these different houses where students actually lived and went to school. And so it was students or young people that were on their way to either going to juvenile corrections or transitioning out of juvenile corrections to go back into society. And so they were there with us every day. They lived with us. There was rules they had to follow and chores they had to do. They went to school. We did activities, basketball, all those sorts of things to really kind of help them transition and develop relationships with their parents and be good people out in society when they left.
So you were a house parent probably in those, is that maybe the title? My title was house parent. I did a similar deal at a place called the Ruth Dyckman Center in Seattle. So
I don't know if we were maybe parents. I think we'd like to maybe think we were more like uncles and aunts. but yeah, I did a lot of my laundry there, slept a lot on couches there. I spent a lot of times with the kids playing basketball, going fishing, boating, a number of excursions out there and really trying to develop relationships with the students. In the early days, it was really fun because sometimes you would have students for 1 or 2 or 3 years, and so you really got to develop these deep relationships. But as time went on, they started to shorten some of the stay, and so sometimes you had 1 to 3 months where you really had an opportunity to interact with these students and try to impact their lives.
So what did you learn? What are the 2 or 3 takeaways from that period of your life?
I think helping students just kind of having day-to-day rituals. Some of the students there may not have had a bed to sleep on at home, or sheets on their bed, or consistent meals, and so some of those day-to-day rituals to be able to have in their lives. I think the other part is there's a lot to be said about putting your arm around a kid and telling them that you love them, and showing them that you love them and that you care about them. And I think if you do that, it really empowers them to realize that people out in this world do care about me. I do have some value. There are some little things that I can actually create for myself if I continue on this path of love as I move forward.
We'll have to get there. There's a why behind how you got involved in that. That would be my hunch, and so we'll have to come back and talk a little bit about that. But prior to, so you're both at Whitewater, and so how did you two meet at Whitewater?
Well, Amy at the time was a student athletic trainer, and I was a graduate assistant football coach, and we were at a football camp, and I think it was a youth football camp, and one day I noticed this really good-looking athletic trainer, and I said, hey, if you can throw me a spiral, I'll buy you a soda, and she threw kind of this duckish football at me.
It was a perfect spiral. Yeah.
But nonetheless, I bought her a soda, and we went out on a date, and kind of the rest is history. And for us, it's been great because our kids have grown up on college campuses, and they've had an opportunity to interact with college students. Now, the downside is our kids both think they thought they've been 21 since like they're 4 years old, right? Because all their friends are college students. But it's been a great experience for us to build a family on a college campus.
What Nelson doesn't believe me, when I was a freshman at UW-Whitewater, he was coaching GA, and I was working out with my best friend because we both were playing softball, and he came into the weight room, and I said to my best friend, I said, I'm gonna marry that guy someday. And so, true freshman, right? And he's just a little bit older than me. And so she laughed for, I felt like a half hour, because she's like, there's no way you're even going to meet him. And so 2 years later, that's when we had the perfect spiral and have started conversations. So
yeah, many pounds ago. I probably looked pretty good walking to the weight room.
Well, there's always hope. Hope springs eternal for us as we get older. But now, okay, so you were, Amy, you started off in athletic training. Was that and so there were a few years separated you, and then, so you started off in athletic training, but it sounds like your relationship started as a friendship, which is, I think, how the best relationships, long-term relationships begin. So tell me about your interest in athletic training, because you're not doing athletic training now. I want to talk about kind of what both of you do now, but how'd that happen?
yeah, so, well, I think when I first met Nelson, I told him I was going to be a physician. And then as I started learning more about athletic training, being able to work with that young, healthy population specifically, then I met the head athletic trainers at the institutions, and I just really just fell in love with anatomy and how the body functions and works and how it can heal and repair itself, and then the great opportunity to help these students recover and then see them back on their playing surface and being successful. So that was more of my calling. But I also was a chemistry minor, just in case I wanted to go that route in becoming a physician or potentially a physical therapist. But no, I just really enjoyed the athletic training. Working tremendous hours, right? Because when you're in athletics, that's what happens. But it did provide just a great opportunity for our family and our children to be exposed to all those opportunities in athletics.
So probably, my guess is, similar skill set. The draw was in athletic training, you had the opportunity for extended relationships, whereas as a physician, you don't.
No.
It's kind of in and out, and it's even more challenging now for physicians. It's like on a 10-minute rotation with patients. So the opportunity to develop long-term relationships wouldn't be there in a way that I imagine it was probably some pretty powerful relationships in the athletic training, because you're dealing with all the emotions.
Yes.
You're dealing with the heartbreak, you're dealing with the setback, you're dealing with anxiety, you're dealing with healing, and then you're probably having, my guess is, the most important conversations are conversations that happen after trust develops. That goes into conversations around school and relationships and insecurities. And am I right about that?
Yes, lots of brain health involved with athletic training. So any athletic trainer you see, please say thank you for your service, because it is, it's cumbersome. I mean, it's not only getting their physical health back to as normal as you can get them, but the brain health side with all the things you just mentioned, and the roller coaster that they go through, the setback of, okay, we're going to see if you can run at full speed, let's see how this looks, and then when they persevere, it's just amazing. It's very rewarding.
So as an athletic trainer, when you're in season, just off the top of your head, how many hours a week do you work? I mean, it's got to be insane, but
60 to 80.
Yeah. And when you're coaching in season?
Well, for me, I've always been a coach in something else at the Division III level, and so in season, you're probably 90 to 100 hours a week to get the things that you need to, and then the off season is 70 to 80.
It's a little bit like, I started off, I still am an ordained minister, but I can remember shaking hands after a worship service saying, you've got the best job in the world. It's just 15 minutes and smile a lot. And I'm like, actually, it's a little more complex than that. And I think often people in the stands would look and they see the game. They don't see what's all behind it. And there's an enormous amount behind it. But that's not where you've sort of not evolved, but you pursued various paths. I know, Amy, you were in athletic administration, and then when we met, you were involved in Cleary and Title IX work, and my guess is most of our audience doesn't understand what that is, so can you talk a little bit about what is Cleary, what is Title IX, why is it important, what's that all about?
Yeah, I did have an unusual route to where I am today. In college is when I joined the military and was a medic in the military, and then went into athletic administration. And my focus in athletic administration was compliance as well, NCAA and FERPA and HIPAA, all the alphabet soups.
So those are the privacy laws.
Correct,
yeah.
Yep. And so then from there, I went over to UW-Madison and focused more on the Jean Cleary Act. So
tell us what that is.
Sure. So the Jean Cleary Act is a consumer protection law that requires universities that receive federal funding, which is the majority of the country, to follow certain reporting structures on any crime that occurs on campus. So it can be anything from, more significant murder, manslaughter, to aggravated assault, to sexual misconduct, harassment. So it's to let the public know when they're looking at the University of Dubuque or any institution that they can get a sense of what type of crime is occurring on their campus, what are the policies and procedures in place, essentially how are you going to protect my son or daughter that's coming to your institution.
So Jean Cleary was a young woman, was a student at a school in the Northeast, and my recollection is she was brutally raped and murdered, and all of that wasn't made public, and so until after the fact. And so the purpose of the act is to make public, to declare kind of what's happening on college campuses for those who are endeavoring to kind of doing their homework to decide whether to attend college, et cetera, and what protocols are in place, what measures are in place to educate and to hopefully prepare a safe environment for students. Is that
correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Cleary family hit the pavement and said, we thought this was a really safe institution that we had our daughter at. And then they found through investigation and finally getting the reports from their campus safety and security that they had over 30 pretty violent crimes in a couple years there. So
30?
Yeah, it was pretty significant.
So this was 20 years ago or so, or more? Yeah. Well, I want to talk more about that because that also goes into your work, Nelson, as Dean of Student Engagement, and you're involved with students at every level, and so working with young people is an enormous privilege. It's an enormous opportunity, and everyone comes. It's an enormous challenge every year because it's different every year, based upon the mix, the experiences, the backgrounds, the hopes, the dreams, the anxieties, the shortcomings, the strengths of whatever that entering class is. So, that's all part of developing a culture, as Cleary is part of developing a healthy culture. And how do you think about that with students? How did you when you think about student engagement and formation, and what are you trying to accomplish with students? Are there some elements from your earlier work to your work now that carry over into what you think about today?
I think so. You know, parents drop off their son or daughter, right, and that's their pride and joy, and so you have to always remember that that's someone's son or daughter that they're putting in your care to help develop. And so I think a lot of it about football, right? Football, you may get a freshman that comes in developmentally 12 or 14 years old, and so I have my work cut out to make this person a young man when they leave me in 4 years. And so I've got to try ways to manipulate and allow that formation to happen over the next 4 years. But I also have to get this student athlete ready for the day-to-day activities and make day-to-day improvements, week-to-week improvements, semester to semester. And you got to be involved in all aspects of their lives, right? There's the football side, there's the training side, there's the classroom side, there's the relationship side. And so how are you being involved and invested in all those types of areas to kind of help development in all those different areas in their lives? And engagement is the same way, right? And so you have to do it for the masses. And now that you're an administrator, how can you make sure that your staff is living and modeling those things that tie into our mission to really help bring this student from a freshman to a senior where you want them to be and live our mission, but also those day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month things that you have to do to be involved in students' lives. And so are we developing the processes and procedures to be dynamic enough to do those things, but also are we doing the day-to-day things to really impact change in these students?
So now I'm starting to understand the 90 to 100 hours a week. So it becomes a way of life. It's to call it a job. You used the word vocation earlier, calling earlier. It's a way of life. I mean, you can't, my guess is you're not able to shut it off at 5 o'clock or 9 o'clock. So when you're thinking about students, I mean, I've noticed I have in my mind sort of growth points in their 4 to 5 years here. How do you see, when you look at sort of a student, I realize we're at different places, but what kinds of things are you looking for to identify their growth and progression? What do you think about?
I think just in terms of how they handle situations when they don't go well, what resources, who are they turning to, how do they communicate with you, have they started to grow this trust and this feeling that they can come to you? I think if they can start developing those relationships, you start to see that growth. When I think about football, probably one of the best players I've ever coached was a 12 to 14-year-old, and we absolutely love him. My daughters love him to this day. We went to his wedding, but there were a lot of challenging times. I had to suspend him for a couple days, or a couple games rather, and I almost wanted to suspend him for his senior year because he wasn't necessarily where we were, and he did some disappointing things after he graduated, but now he's a father, he's a husband, he's a business owner, and so you know that sometimes as a coach, some of the things you're saying to players, some of the things you're saying to students here on campus in engagement, they may not take root until they're 24, 25, 26, but you got to stay the course and understand what you're doing is going to impact the lives of these students at some point in time if you're doing it right and you're being genuine about it.
You know, I think that's a really good point and a really good bit of insight that I think back to my experience on campus. Most of the flashpoints incidents we've had on campus, specifically incidents around race and inclusion, I'm sure there's an exception, but most of the time, the parties that are involved are first or second year students, not always, but almost inevitably. I think I'd have to go, I'm going through in my mind here, and I think that's pretty close to accurate. So there is on a college, we're 100 acres of beautiful buildings and lawns, but we're also, I like to think of us as a small city in some regards, full of very interesting but very imperfect human beings. And so there is an element of, when we think about engagement, there's an element of maturation, not just intellectual maturation, but interpersonal and maturation of emotions, and so we're back to the 90 to 100 hours a week again. There's no way you can do that work, my guess is, without getting your hands dirty, metaphorically. I mean, you've got to be in the mix of it, otherwise it just, my guess is you're not in your office much, is what I'm saying.
You're going to a lot of events, interacting with a lot of students. You're texting kids, maybe calling kids at different times during the year in the summer, seeing how they're doing, just having conversations about what's going on. You maybe send some guy humor texts here and there to try to develop a little bit of a bond and in that relationship with the students as well as with the student athletes. But yeah, you make it at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight text, and sometimes you have to remember to tell students well, in my case, just turned 50, so that's well past my bedtime. So,
yeah. A lot of them are just waking up. Yes. Very, very, very nocturnal, I've found out. So both of you, one of the commonalities is clearly you love young people, and you love being around young people, and students, people who are on a journey. We're all on a journey, and have you noticed? And you've been doing this work for a long time. I mean, you've both been engaged in higher ed. Amy, how many years have you?
25 years.
I was, from undergrad to currently, over 20 years.
Yeah. And you as well, Nelson. Yeah.
25 to 30 years.
Yeah. So.
Oh, gosh.
Sorry about that.
More than some of our students have been alive.
I know, thank you, President Bullock.
Every once in a while. Yeah. I'm even longer, so there we go. So when you think about that, I mean, what has stayed the same and what has changed over that 25 years? So let's take what has stayed the same. What's the constant in that 25-year period?
Just the need to assist people. I mean, now I have been kind of not as involved with students, but when I reflect on where I was, 15 years ago to where I am now, our students are still struggling with the same challenges, just maybe in a little different way. Technology, right, is
social media.
Social media
didn't
is a
exist
big
25
impact.
years ago.
Right.
At least, no, it didn't. It didn't exist 25 years ago.
So that's a whole different layer of stress and anxiety, but all those things have been a part of their development, regardless of what stage they're in. And if it wasn't through social media, it was through the interpersonal relationships or lack thereof. And so I think that's all similar. It just has a little different twist on it.
Mm-hmm. How about you?
I think when I was younger in higher ed, you focus a lot on the wins, and the good things that are going on. I think as you get a little bit older, you realize some of the losses, and you become to not be very happy with the losses and a little bit more competitive. You get back to your younger days and have a lot more wins, and so it's really recognizing the challenges to create more wins on a campus and what's causing students to not be part of that winning formula. And so I think you get older, you want to leave a legacy and make some sort of an impact. And so for me, that's been the biggest difference. You can be young and carefree, and you're focusing on winning football games and helping kids graduate, and you forget about the ones that quit the team or don't get a degree.
Right. Well, and I think as we get older, there's a sense of, the way I describe it is, I mean, you two we're all a long way from the end of the runway, but we're not at the beginning of the runway. And so you sort of have a different perspective of time. And at least for me, there's almost kind of a sense of urgency, because not that I wasn't urgent before, but there's a sense of urgency about there's some things you want to get done and things you want to get accomplished because you know more and you're satisfied with a few things, but you also see the challenges more so than you see, I think, the successes. But what has changed in 25 years? We talked about social media. I remember here 25 years ago, the discussion was that, for our operating system or word processing system, do we do Word or WordPerfect? perfect, and there was a 2-week, 3-week debate on that. Well, nobody's ever heard of word perfect anymore except me. I'm the only one on campus who still regrets not going word perfect because I had all the codes memorized and everything, and I still don't have word figured out, but that's where we were. A lot has changed. So what has changed in your sense in working with students and in higher ed over the last 25 years? What do you list as the top 2 or 3 biggest things that have changed?
I think the way in which you have to communicate with students has changed, quite a bit. You have to have multiple mediums to reach out and communicate with them. Nothing, probably will ever take the place of just getting out and pounding the pavement and developing relationships that way. But before, it seemed like you could email kids or call kids and get a hold of them, where now you're texting and Snapchatting and doing some of those things to communicate with kids. And so that's been a challenge, to find ways to engage students in different ways.
And that's all changing. I mean, that changes daily practically, the platforms that student engage with. Would you agree with that? Or what else do you see, Amy?
Yeah, I think that communication is the bigger part, and just kind of breaking down those barriers for the students. Some of the students that I have met with since I've been on campus have offered whatever I can do to help. Don't be afraid to come and ask. I'm happy to help whenever I can. And I know there's a resistance, right? There's a fear to come and approach perhaps me or others to ask for that help. That's a difficult word for anybody, let alone an 18 to 24-year-old who.
Why do you think that is? What's fearful about it?
I don't know. I think maybe because I know for sure I haven't developed all those relationships, right? So I don't have that trust factor, and so for me to arbitrarily say, hey, I'm happy to help, and whatever I can do, please let me know. And until they take me up on it, I can't prove, right, that I'm going to follow through on it. So I'm sure there's just some hesitancy in whether or not they can trust what I say and do. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge, is just that students to have the comfort to ask for help when they need it, because it is scary. But I think here, since I've been here, everyone on this campus wants to be able to assist our students. And it seems to me are keeping themselves available to do that. And so it's just a matter of, like Nelson had said, developing those relationships and making them feel comfortable and vulnerable enough, if you will, to take that first step.
So you have to want to do it. I think that's probably, not every campus wants to do it. I mean, I think to your point, there's this, at least my experience with a lot of campuses is, we're doing you a favor by kind of admitting you. So, it's kind of the we're not worthy is kind of approach to students. You're not at my level yet, therefore, until you progress, I'm not going to invest the time. Whereas that's kind of the antithesis of our kind of culture here, which is, you have to. The way I describe it to people is the faculty and staff members who do best here. Susan Smith, who is no longer with us, used to have a phrase. She would say, until you've spent some time in sorrow's kitchen, you don't really get who we are. But those who can point to a moment in their life where they've spent some time in sorrow's kitchen usually do pretty well here. And I thought, that is really a good bit of insight. When I look at our faculty and staff, those who spent a little time in sorrow's kitchen, some less, some more, there's a kind of there's a patience and an empathy that works really well here for what we're trying to do missionally. Have you experienced that in your relative to you? It's not across the board, I'm sure, but would you agree with that? Is that a fair assessment of kind of how we are?
I think so, and I think for a lot of our students early on, sometimes you have to care more than they do, right? Until they have the trust and the understanding and the support to start to care as much as you do about them and about their successes. And so I see a lot of that here on campus, is that it would be easy to say, this student's giving up, I'm going to give up on them. And it's like, no, I'm not. I care about this student. I know the student can be successful. And so you see that, and you see that personalized approach that for us was really refreshing to come from a larger public institution and not see that, or not be able to always work with students from their freshman through their senior year, grad school, PhD. And so here I see that on a day-to-day basis, people really caring about students and caring more than they do initially.
Well, that's almost harder, though. I mean, because you'd said earlier that, you know, you talk about the stumbles students have, and culturally we're in a time where often those stumbles don't just result in a timeout or time in the penalty box. The result is there's a cultural drive to jettison students from campus, you know, and I run into that periodically with some pretty kind of high-profile situations here. And you know, my sense, I mean, there are occasions when that needs to happen, but I've also tried to think of our mission. You know, the phrase we use is we're a faith-based organization of teaching and learning. And I kind of go back to the two sort of insights I've had from talking with both of you, is the learning often happens when things aren't going well. That's where the best opportunity to learn is. Yet culturally there's kind of a drive to make an example out of that human, you know, but we learn the most, it seems like, when we do boneheaded things or insensitive, uncaring things. But that creates kind of a dicey environment. So how do we communicate that message? How does, I mean, let's just, with all that's going on in the world right now, it began before George Floyd's murder, but all that's happening in the country right now. I know that this fall is going to be a fascinating, interesting, intense time with students, with faculty and staff. Part of it is just the separation from COVID and extended periods of separation and what that does to our brains. And, you know, as humans, we're relational, most of us are. We need relationships to kind of keep us. We're going to have this massive influx of humanity here. They're coming from all around the world, all across the country, and there are going to be incidents. There just are. How are we going to manage that? What do we do as a community? How do we think about that as leaders on campus? What are we trying to teach and model?
I think one of the nice things about this fall, maybe for all of us, is that we're all going to be in the same boat. We all need to teach, we all need to learn, and it needs to be reciprocated on both sides. And so it's really going to force us all to come and be on both sides, a student and a teacher and a community member, right? And so I think that will be helpful, that we all are going to be starting on the same foundation, right? Because COVID-19 is unknown for all of us. There seems to be a push in our society collectively to say enough's enough. It's 2020. We need to address things systematically that we haven't addressed it on our campus. And so I think there's a desire from everyone to do those things, and I think there's a desire from everyone to kind of learn how we can best do that, how to teach one another, help one another.
So there's got to be, so one of the keys to doing that is there's got to be a collective sense of humility. And part of humility is just admitting our own ignorance. But that puts us in a vulnerable place. But in order to learn, we've got to be vulnerable. So collectively, we've got to be more vulnerable, which is really hard to do. Yeah, it's really hard to do. It's really hard to do. Yeah. Well, welcome to the human race. Right? So when we think of, both of you are very involved in kind of the subject we're kind of nibbling around the edges on is, you know, in the academy, but in our culture, there are issues of kind of the subject of diversity and inclusion. We hear these words, and you know, there are a lot lot of folks that maybe don't know what we're talking about when we talk about diversity or inclusion, particularly the inclusion part of it, you know. And so there are other words that you hear a lot. We'll hear words like microaggression, or we'll hear words like white privilege. And if you listen to the news, you don't, which I try to limit myself to, I rarely hear the word now microaggression. I hear the word white privilege occasionally, some outlets more than others. But let's try to unpack those two phrases for folks who maybe don't know what we're talking about, who don't live our lives. So what is a microaggression? What does that mean?
To me, I think we talked about this maybe a couple weeks ago. When you look at being a person of color in this country, you think about all the things that you've experienced, whether it's words, whether it's actions that really have made you feel less than, or really have made you unsafe or violated. And so we really think about that in terms of like childhood trauma, right? And so all these instances of childhood trauma that you've experienced throughout your life, and now you go into adulthood and you've got all these incidences of childhood trauma, and then something happens that triggers that trauma again for you. And so to me, that's, you know, a microaggression. You see what happens to George Floyd, and it triggers in your life all the trauma that you've had to deal with as a person of color. And those are things that when we think about childhood trauma in any area, typically those students are less likely to be successful, you know, in college. Those people are less likely to be successful in life just because of the impact that they have and how those triggers may impact them throughout their lives. And if you're not a person of color, you can hide those triggers, and people may not know what those triggers are, and they don't come along that often. But as a person of color, you are experiencing daily, weekly, monthly traumas that just consistently come back and trigger and make you question who you are and what you can become. And so I think that's the gravity of some of these microaggressions that people, really micro is a bad word because the impact of these things are just so enormous and affect people their whole lives. And so it's especially difficult, I think, as a person of color that's an educator and you want to make a difference in the lives of young people, but you have this system of trauma that's just always chasing the kids that you're trying to help and always trying to beat you down to want to have the energy to be able to make a difference.
So if you're comfortable doing so, help me understand, give me some examples of because this is me. Mm-hmm. So I have, you know, I can think of things in my own life. You know, we all have stories. I can think of things in my own life that, you know, have beat me down or, you know, childhood trauma and things like that, and something will happen and I'm back there. But I'm part of a majority in this country. I can go anywhere in this country and sort of have been there my entire life. Nobody looks at me differently when I walk into Target or Walmart. So as a person of color, what does that experience feel like or look like for those who look more like me and have no idea what you're talking about?
You know, one of the ones I was thinking about this morning when I was in the shower is my mother's father. My mother is white, my dad's black. My mom and my father got married, and her father disowned her. And I never met my grandfather until I was 19. But he had very healthy relationships with my cousins who were all white. And so, and I met him when I was 19 because I was his star football player that was going to the Naval Academy and was doing really good. And now he was towards the end of his life, and now he wanted to establish a relationship. And so imagine 16, 17 years of your life, you have your grandfather that does not want to know you or meet you because you're black. And then you deal with people clutching their purses, locking their doors, calling you the N-word, cops pulling guns on you. Those things, all those things are the traumas that you grow up throughout your life. And then there are other things that continue to make you feel less than, that even a family member doesn't want to accept you because of the color of your skin. And so those are real things that I think we struggle with every day with these kids is, God, if my grandfather doesn't care about me, why does Jeff Bullock care about me? Why does Alan, Garfield care about me? So those things are very difficult.
So it's and maybe this gets to the transition from kind of the microaggression to the privilege. It's those things that I just can't imagine. Like the thought of not loving your grandson would never enter my mind. But that was part of the experience. And okay, so this helps me understand, or not understand. I don't think I can, now I'm getting into my philosophical life, I don't think I can really completely understand it, but I have an insight that I didn't have before. So part of my inability to understand it would be connected to what the phrase "my privilege" is. Is that a fair way to think about this, or not? What do you think? We hear white privilege. What's white privilege? What on earth is this?
I think it's twofold. I think it's hard to understand because you haven't experienced those things, but I also think it's painful, right, to understand because everyone knows who they are and what's in their heart, and they want to separate maybe from the history that's maybe made them blind to some of the things that they just subconsciously do or subconsciously experience. And so I think it's a combination of things. You haven't experienced it, and it's very difficult to really look in and realize it doesn't say anything about you. It says something about the system that's been allowed to be perpetuated for 400 years. And so having that strength to look inside and then having that strength to say, I'll take on this 400-year battle, with brown and black people, and let's find a way to make it happen.
Kind of one battle at a time. Now, James Davison Hunter is a writer I really like, and he talks about, it's easy to watch the news or listen to the news and just say there's nothing I can do. It's just too over. I think that's the problem with watching the news. One of the problems. And he says that we're to lead in what he calls our spheres of influence. So what are our areas of influence in our own individual? Each of us can lead in our sphere of influence. And it seems like this 100 acres is part of that sphere of influence, Nelson, for you. Amy, how do you experience, you and Nelson have been together a while, and you both have different backgrounds, different experiences. What have you learned over the course of time in your relationship with Nelson, and maybe Nelson, what have you learned over the course of time in your relationship with Amy?
It was throughout when we were first dating, just experiencing the different responses from people. Nelson and I were at UW-Whitewater for over 13 years, and there were still people on campus that didn't even know we were married. And so it's just kind of those realities that come forward that you don't necessarily pay attention to, and then all of a sudden one day it just kind of smacks you in the face. Early on when we were dating too, we took a trip down south, and I wanted to hold his hand, and he's like, nope, don't do that down here. And so I'm like, what do you mean?
So why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, I've been down south before where, you buy something and people don't put the change in your hand, they just drop it on the counter. And so there's still these people that don't necessarily feel feel a certain way about people of color, and but also people of color with white people. So
they put the change on the counter because they
don't want to touch your
hands.
hands.
They don't want to touch you. Yeah.
It's like COVID-19 before COVID-19.
Oh, yes, that's a very good insight. So you would be uncomfortable holding hands in public.
Yeah. Well, he told me we couldn't, so I'm like, okay. So that was just, that wasn't anything I ever. Certainly, I knew who Nelson was, and I loved him for who he is, and. So for us to be together was all about our love for each other. So I didn't really think about what the outside world would be, how they would perceive and look at us. That wasn't something that I intentionally thought about. I loved him, and he was he has the best hugs in the world, and it's just kind and caring and compassionate, and so those are all the things that drew me to Nelson. And so I didn't think about that aspect of us being together. So when we were first dating and started traveling with each other and going to different places, and kind of the restrictions of how we could show our love for one another was infuriating. And then we have children, and so having really honest conversations with our children about how people might treat them, help them process how to handle those things, the microaggressions that Nelson was just talking about earlier. And both our daughters are different shades of color, and so they are both experiencing different, currently, different challenges. And so helping them understand that and talking very openly and honestly with each other, I think, is the most important thing to get through those. So hopefully we can give them enough support and arm them with enough confidence and security to help them get through these.
So always the teachers.
Yeah.
always the teachers. And I know your daughters. I don't know them well. I mean, they're really, they both have a unique spark.
Yes.
You know, and the pastor, youth group leader part of me really wants to spend time with them, because I'm like, these two girls can be, I think there's really something special about them and a lot of fun, and I can see that. I know as I'm listening to you talk about your relationship, I had, you know, in my own life had the good fortune of sort of being welcomed into a family that I've referred to as my adopted family. And my adopted mom is Caucasian. My adopted dad, who died a year ago, would be Native American. And I can remember early on, they didn't talk about it much, but I can remember them talking about, so they would have been married in the 50s. And so there was an element of exclusion for my mom in marrying my father. And I can remember he was a pastor, so he's a fisherman in Alaska. But he served, was called to serve a church in Nebraska, and I remember somebody, before the first Sunday, had spray painted on the white chancel wall, "Dirty Indian, go home." So this would have been the late 50s and the early 60s, and this would have been in the middle of Nebraska. So you know, and geography impacts race and bigotry in different ways. In the Midwest, or in parts of the Midwest, it's far fewer in certain communities, African American individuals, but far more Native American, but yet the kinds of, we've talked about, the microaggressions and the I just don't understand it. I guess what's hard for me to understand is how you do that to another human being. And yet, the minute I say that, I also realize that we're part of the doing that to another human being is we're able to do that by objectifying other human beings. And what I mean by that is we essentially turn other human beings into objects, and if they're objects, there isn't a level of interpersonal discomfort. And we turn them into objects by using racial slurs, kind of awful names, derogatory statements, and that's been going on a long time. That's been going on a long time. And so how do you teach through that? So both of you are educators, you're leaders, you're parents. At Nelson, you referenced 400 years. I just kind of put a marker from the 50s to the 60s to the 20s. You know, so that alone is 60 years. I can hear people saying, well, things have improved. And I can also say, well, it probably really matters who's doing the saying there. What do you say to your daughters, or what do you say to the children here, to the students here? How do we think about preparing them for what is and what is to come and what their role is?
You know, we talk a lot with our daughters about things that they could do to disappoint us, right? And so part of that is, hey, we would be disappointed if you didn't feel like you could come to us and talk to us. We would be disappointed in you if you did something that would hurt another human being, right? We would be disappointed if you lied to us. And for me, I think that's a big word for young people, if they know that that they're going to disappoint you, someone that they care about. And so they're going to work hard to not do those things, right? And so I think a lot of it is about that love and about that relationship that will inspire kids not to want to disappoint you. But you have always got to be teachers. You've got to make sure there's always a purpose of your interactions and where you're trying to move the young people that you come across to get to that point, right? I mean, our oldest daughter one day decided she was going to slam her door, right? And so I went and got a hammer and a screwdriver, and she learned that doors actually come off, right? And so she said, "What are you doing? That actually happens?" Yes. And she had a week of, being a 10-year-old without a door on her bedroom. And that 1 week of privacy was probably the most impactful thing, because our youngest daughter, Maddie, has never slammed a door, right? And so nor has Allie again, right? But then you also talk through why you did that. What was the lesson, and how do you teach people, and how do you teach about respect and some of those things? And so there's always teachable and learning moments if you want to grasp them and maybe be the bad guy for 5, 10, 15 minutes a week, 2 weeks, whatever the case may be. We have to be willing to do that and understand the method of our madness, right? We've always got to be moving kids forward to a point where they need to be successful. And so we got to take advantage of those little opportunities. And so it's the same thing in football. Sometimes I yell at guys, not even about what they did. They may have done the right thing, but I'm yelling at you to see how you're going to handle adversity and how you respond. And then you're going to walk over and pout, and now I can come over and put my arm around you and teach you and walk you through how you're going to deal with adversity in life. And so we've got to see those teachable moments, and we've got to grasp them, and we've got to have a method of our madness to bring students there. It's not about just scoring touchdowns. If you leave here the all-time leading rusher, but you're not prepared to be a man, then I failed you. And so I think we've got to think that about our students as well.
And really helping them learn that emotional wellness, that emotional health, right? Because anger and fear drive a lot of our emotion.
Say more about that. That's an interesting thought.
One of the things that we talk to our daughters about as they, as they're growing and developing and evolving, is talking to them about what can you control? What are the things that you can control? You yourself control. And it's attitude and effort. And so whatever they do, however they approach something, and certainly they're not going to agree with things, but how are you going to handle it in that moment? What are the things that you can truly control in that moment? And that's how you respond to it and your effort towards it. So I think that has helped them, in my opinion, especially with this move in the middle of, just starting as a high school student and we're coming right in middle school, and the different adversities that they've had and challenges they had. I'm hopeful that phrase has helped them. We say it so often, I think now, as soon as if they're saying something to us and we kind of look at them, I think then they're like, I know, attitude and effort, so. But it's a simple phrase that can be really impactful on how to handle that fear and anger.
I think back, as you know, we have three sons. Who are older teenagers, young 20s now, and when I look back on my biggest regrets as a parent, when I was really angry, what I realized, it took me a while to realize this, that the anger was really about the fear. That it came out angry, but I was fearful for what could have happened. And I think that's a really important point to be made, is how do we control, how do we, I don't even want to know if control's the right word, how do we understand that so we can use those moments as moments of an opportunity for improvement. I mean, if I'm having a difficult time struggling with that in those years as a, mid-40s, early 50-year-old, how do we think about that with 17, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds? There really is. I hadn't thought about that. That's where the real connection is, isn't it? Fear or anger? Fear or anger? Anger or fear?
I think you hit it on the head when you talked about being vulnerable, right? And so where are we at as adults, as faculty, as staff, as administrators? Are we willing to be vulnerable in front of the young people that we work with? Are we willing to be vulnerable with our staff? I think that allows a real deep connection and forces them too to be willing to be vulnerable. And I think we're all going to have to be vulnerable when we come back here in the fall, right? To have to be able to be teachers and leaders on both sides and develop community. We're going to have to kind of break down some of these walls and open up and let ourselves be human and vulnerable to the people that we interact with. And that's not easy. That's not easy to do, because it's easy to come to work and do your job and be a professional and maybe, wall off your personal life and wall off your feelings. And I think we've got to really understand that our mission is forcing us to break those walls down and forcing us to be vulnerable. And we need to be vulnerable for our students when they come back in the fall.
I have said that. I appreciate you mentioning the mission, because it'd be a lot easier to do it another way. And as I've said in multiple situations, it'd be a lot easier not to care. It'd be a lot easier not to care. It'd be a lot easier just to kind of pack it, 9 to 5, but it seems like we're missing exercising, we're missing an opportunity in our sphere of influence, to go back to Hunter. So you two are both, and we'll kind of start wrapping it up, but you two are both newer. So like, you're not in the really deep water here, but we've kind of gone to where you're right at the point where that little barrier goes across the pool that says, all right, shallow end, deep end. So you know enough about the university and its mission to be more aware than you were 2 years ago. And you haven't been here so long that you've given up on any kind of progress. So there's an informed naivete or an informed hopefulness. What would you like to see happen here in the next 5 years? If you could, the best question I get to ask students is if I could wave a magic wand and give you 3 wishes, what 3 things would you like to see happen here in the next 5 years? And there's no wrong answer here.
Well, for me, I think it's moving past maybe that era of transformation where you're trying to survive, and now getting to that point where you're putting processes and procedures in place that are going to allow you to be, you can adapt, you can be dynamic, but you can start to thrive as an institution. And so I think just getting those processes and procedures and strategic planning so that you can come together as a unit, you can collaborate together as an institution. Now you can be innovative and creative and really kind of meet the needs of your students on the campus population. As we were talking about earlier, as a person of color, on every campus I've been on, we don't do a very good job as professionals of color coming together and developing community and letting our students see how people of color come together and develop community, how professionals actually exist on our campus. And so doing a better job as professionals of color coming together on this campus, developing community, being there for our students and modeling the way for our students. But I think also letting our predominantly white students see people of color congregating in the cyber cafe, professionals having lunch, talking about change here on our campus. And so certainly want to be able to see those things. And I think the other thing is probably just finding ways to better engage our students, right? I think in some ways social media and some of those things have made our students hermits. And so we've got to find a better way to get our students out and engaged. And I think one of the benefits of COVID-19 is our kids want to come back to school. They want to engage with one another, and we're going to have a captive audience. And so we've got to capitalize on that from the start.
Yeah, I've noticed that they really want to be together. I think they need to be together. How about you? If you could wave your magic wand, Amy, what would you like to see happen the next 1, 2, 3, or 5 years?
Yeah, so because of the work I'm in, specific with Title IX, if you will, and sexual assault, misconduct, and crime, the big thing that I would like to see is a culture of bystander intervention.
So say more about that. What is that?
So having the comfort that if you see something going wrong, that you say something. That you don't make it okay for another person to disrupt or hurt another person, either verbally or physically. That it doesn't escalate to a part where then now Dubuque Police Department's coming in, right? And so being able to support one another, intervene with each other, be peer-to-peer educators, I think is really important for that personal growth and development. Because after they leave us, I mean, that's the continued role they have within their own community, wherever they end up. If it's not here in the city of Dubuque, but back home, they have to keep each other safe within their communities. And so I think here is a good opportunity with the diversity that we have on campus, international and domestic students from all over, to watch out for one another and start developing that community of, hey, we're here to protect each other in these 100 acres. Let's live and learn from each other. Let's be peer-to-peer educators. So that's my big thing that I would love to see in the next 5 years or sooner.
So if I were, okay, let's role play a little bit here. If I'm being sort of inappropriate, saying something inappropriate in sort of the cyber cafe, and what's a good way? What are some good ways that as faculty and staff members or other students, what do you say to sort of diffuse that situation, to stay vulnerable and humble, but also to be assertive? How do you approach situations like that?
Yeah, I think for student to student, it's more like, dude, that's not all right. Right? Or, hey, let's not.
I hear the word dude a lot.
Dude,
so,
that's
okay.
why I went to dude.
Yeah, okay.
So I having that courage really to be outside of yourself and say to someone, hey, that's not all right.
So it's not a lecture so much as it is kind of a verbal timeout, kind of a verbal, dude, that's a little over the top.
And I just met you, and I thought you were a pretty cool person, and wow, that surprises me that you said something like that.
Okay.
Or, hey, that's not appropriate because this was an experience I had. Or, so I think it's kind of giving a self-check that maybe this is a comfortable conversation, or the words you are using is comfortable for you, but know that for me, that's not okay, and here's why. So it's not like you're a bad person. It's more of, hey, this is our community in our neighborhood, and so let's hold each other accountable, versus an employee or staff or faculty or someone coming in and now trying to reprimand that person, if you will, because of that vulnerability, right? To say, man, that's not okay for you to say, and here's why. This is what's happening when I hear that.
So what's wonderful about the way you've just expressed that for us is it's not judgmental. It's not, I don't like this phrase, obviously because of what I do, but it's not preacherly. You're not preaching. You're in the process of revealing, this actually is kind of hurtful, and so what we're trying to do is give students and each other tools. Correct. to be better.
To intervene in a safe way. So it's not, and that person has to know what that toolbox is and feel comfortable with that toolbox in order to implement it. So back in one of my prior institutions, I was giving a survey to a student athlete group, and one of the student athletes was talking about a video game that they were playing with another person. And he said something to the effect of, oh, that game raped me. And I said, So I walked away for a moment, and then I came back, and I said, I just want to say, or ask you why you said that. And he's like, well, I lost, and that person was dominating me in the game, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, do you understand what that word means, the word rape that you used? Do you understand what that is? And he's like, well, yeah. And I said, okay, so if there were other women or other people in the room, would you still use that language? And he's like, well, no. I said, okay, I just want to bring it to your attention that even though that's an easy thing for you to say with your peers, know that that word has a tremendous impact on different people for different reasons. I said, so just be aware of that. And so just taking those little bit of moments to have that 30-second conversation, to not use that, the R word, right? And so retarded, not using that word, because what does that mean and what does that look like? So it's all those kind of, I'm gonna say common words that people use in general conversation, that why are you using that word? Take a moment to think about what that means to you or maybe others. So having those kind of bystander peer-to-peer education moments, I think, is really critical for the development of a society.
In my ecclesial life, I would refer to both of you as missionaries. I mean, you have to have a bit of a missionary spirit to do this work, because the work is never done, is it?
No.
The work is never done, though this conversation will continue, but is probably done for today. But you do. That's a good place to end. I mean, you have to have a bit of a missionary spirit. You have to be, missionaries have to put themselves out there. They have to they have to learn to be comfortable in an unfamiliar environment. They have to be knowledgeable, but the best ones are always more curious and humble than anything, at least in my experience. And I remember there was an elderly missionary named Gladys Whitmore who went up to teach at a native school in Alaska. And she was, when I got to know her, I mean, I thought she was about 190 when I first met her, and she's probably my age right now. But I remember her lecturing me in an inappropriate way. Jeffrey, never forget who signs your paycheck, meaning, pay attention to your responsibilities, and you'll have opportunities, but pay attention to your responsibilities first. And I remember her, she was from Ohio and ended up becoming a missionary in Alaska, and at a native school. And she was a teacher, and she was terribly, terribly homesick. And so she was very young, and she wrote a letter back home, sent it back. Her mother was gone. Father was a farmer. He was illiterate, and so her brother had to read the letter to her father about how she wanted to come home. She was homesick. Would he please send the money so she could get home? And anyway, she got a letter back. And she said it was a very brief letter. It was written by her brother. And the letter said, "Pa says he won't have any quitters in his house." And I'm like, oh. And Gladys ended up being at that school, and she was there over 50 years. And is a legend in that part of Alaska. Touched many, many lives. I hope the two of you have a Gladys Whitmore 50-year run here, because I can see you impacting lives in some I already see it, but in some pretty dramatic, important ways. And in my world, that's a life well lived. That's what we're here for. So thanks for being here. Thanks for talking with me. I hope it's been okay, and we'll do it again. Thanks for your good work.